We often imagine kindness as an infinite spring, a wellspring that continuously replenishes itself. But if you are one of the genuinely kind people in the world, the one everyone turns to, the one who never says no, you know a darker, more exhausting truth. You sit alone in the quiet of your own home, long after you have fulfilled the last promise, answered the final desperate call, and fixed the last frayed edge of someone else's life. And in that stillness, a strange hollowness settles in. You are not feeling the proud glow of virtue. You are not feeling the warmth of connection. All you hear is the hollow echo of yourself, calling back from a place that feels impossibly distant. There is a weariness in your eyes that no amount of sleep seems to touch. You have perfected the art of the agreeable smile, the quiet nod, the supportive presence. But behind that practiced composure, a deeper paradox is unfolding. The kindest people you know are often the most internally depleted. We have been conditioned to see this depletion as a badge of honor, a necessary cost of being a good person. But what if this exhaustion is not a side effect of compassion, but the primary symptom of something much more fundamental? What if the kindness you are giving is not flowing from abundance, but is being forcibly squeezed out from an inner emptiness? The core emotional pain we are exploring here is not burnout, though you feel that acutely. It is the subtle, pervasive act of self-abandonment, perfectly disguised beneath the sacred veneer of compassion. You have learned, perhaps since childhood, that your own needs are negotiable. You learn that to be loved, to be safe, to be recognized, you must prioritize the comfort and stability of others over the truth of your own experience. This is the subtle mechanism of conditional love at work, and you carried that contract, unspoken, unsigned, into adulthood. Kindness became less about giving and more about surviving. This is the moment where the shadow falls across the wellspring, when the smile is forced, when the yes is a betrayal of the no screaming inside your chest. That act ceases to be genuine kindness. It becomes a performance. And every time you step into that role, you retreat further from the authentic self. You create a separation between the person the world sees, the tireless, stable, generous figure, and the person you actually are, who is tired, resentful, and yearning for space. You become a stranger in your own skin. If you look closely at that exhaustion, it carries the weight of a quiet question. What about me? That question is the first sign of a deeper crisis, a sense of loss that cannot be cured by a vacation or a change of scenery. It is the loss of your own boundaries, the systematic erasure of your own desires, until you realize you no longer know what you want, where you end, and where the other person begins. Your entire identity has been built on the architecture of serving others. This leads to a pervasive sense of flatness, a muted existence. You are present, you are functional, but you are not experiencing the full spectrum of life. You are, in essence, suffering from the Anhedonia of the quiet giver, the inability to find genuine joy and pleasure for yourself. Because all available emotional and psychological resources have been diverted externally. The engine of your life is running on fumes, and joy requires fuel. The tragic irony is that in your desperate attempt to be seen as good, you have trained the world, and more importantly, you have trained yourself to overlook the most important person in the room. The first step in understanding this pain is to stop calling it a flaw and start calling it what it truly is: a systemic psychological injury sustained in the pursuit of acceptance. To understand this internal mechanism, we have to recognize the immense physical and psychological effort required to sustain the performance of boundless kindness. It is a constant holding pattern, a repression of the authentic, often messy truth. Imagine, for a moment, the hidden emotional cost of that constant agreeable presence, not as a metaphor for exhaustion, but as a literal physical burden. Imagine the kindness that does not include your own needs as a silent weight, a custom-fitted armor that, over time, becomes heavier and heavier. When you say yes when you desperately need rest, you are adding one small link to a chain that wraps around your core. When you smile through exhaustion to avoid conflict, you are welding another plate onto that armor. Initially, this armor feels protective. It shields you from rejection and earns you the quiet admiration of your peers. But the material of this armor is made of suppressed needs, unvoiced anger, and denied boundaries, and it is crafted from pure lead. You walk through your days seemingly free, but you are carrying this immense, silent weight. You become aware of it most acutely not when you are helping someone, but in the small, unguarded moments afterward, waiting for the elevator to arrive, standing in line for coffee, or staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night. It is in these voids that the resentment begins to leak. Resentment is often misunderstood. It is not malice. It is purely and simply the psychological pain generated by self-betrayal. It is the internal reaction to the realization that you have allowed yourself to be sacrificed, not for a great cause, but for the sake of avoiding temporary discomfort or conflict. Behind every saintly act of self-sacrifice, lending money you don't have, canceling your own plans for the 5th time, listening for the 9th hour, a quiet, insistent voice begins to whisper, "What about me?" Who is taking care of the caregiver? And here is where the deeper damage occurs. You have been conditioned to silence that whisper immediately. You tell yourself that acknowledging that resentment is selfish, petty, or ungrateful. You believe that kindness and self-interest are mutually exclusive concepts. To be kind, you must not put yourself first. By silencing that voice, you are essentially burying the truth. You are taking your natural, self-protective emotions, the anger that signals a crossed boundary, the frustration that signals depletion, and you are packing them down, deep inside the ground of your being. This suppression does not erase the feelings. It simply ferments them. They collect in the shadows, becoming toxic, not because the emotions themselves are dark, but because they have been denied light and air. This is the creation of the emotional backlog, and it is the necessary precursor to the kind of sudden, uncontrolled emotional outburst, snapping at someone you love over something trivial, passive-aggressive behavior, or a complete and total emotional shutdown that leaves you shocked at the person you have become. You think you are being kind by maintaining the peace, but you are merely creating the perfect dark breeding ground for chaos. The heavy, silent armor is beginning to crack under the weight of the very emotions it was designed to contain. And when it breaks, the explosion is often directed at the safest people in your life, not the ones who caused the original wound. The cinematic image, then, is not the generous hand extended, but the exhausted face of the giver, captured in the split second after the transaction is complete. When the forced smile drops and the leaden weight of their own suppression settles back onto their shoulders. It is the moment of quiet collapse, sustained only by the momentum of the next performance. What we call compassion fatigue is not a failure of character. It is a profound system failure in the architecture of your brain. To understand the depth of this exhaustion, we must look at the hidden costs of agreeable behavior on the nervous system itself. The first mechanism at play is the dopamine hijack, the chemical basis of that addiction to external validation. When you are conditioned to believe love is conditional, your brain begins to view acceptance as a primary reward, equivalent to food or safety. Every time you sacrifice your need for rest, or override your desire to say no, and the other person responds with praise, relief, or affection, your brain registers a small, sharp burst of dopamine. This dopamine is a chemical signal reinforcing the action. This is what keeps you safe. Do it again. Your reward system becomes fundamentally miscalibrated. It is hijacked. True, authentic connection, the quiet, mutual satisfaction of balanced giving, registers only a low, steady frequency. But the high-stakes performance of self-sacrifice, followed by relief from the fear of rejection, delivers a high-frequency spike. Your brain begins to prioritize the performance because it delivers the faster, sharper chemical hit. Kindness, in this context, becomes less of a virtue and more of a deeply ingrained, neurologically reinforced habit driven by fear. This state of chronic performance directly impacts the two key structures responsible for emotional regulation: the prefrontal cortex, PFC, and the amygdala. Your PFC, the seat of executive function, is responsible for boundaries, rational planning, and self-awareness. It's the part that knows you need to say no or set limits. But when you are operating under the fear of rejection, the constant need to please, your amygdala, the brain's fear alarm, is continuously activated at a low hum. The amygdala's constant activation drains the PFC. Every time you override your PFC's rational decision to rest, and instead defer to the amygdala's fear of conflict, You are essentially depleting the energy reserves of the very part of your brain that is supposed to protect you. This is why, when you are exhausted, your boundaries crumble instantly. Your PFC has been starved. But the most insidious impact of this chronic people-pleasing happens in the body's superhighway of connection, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve connects your brainstem to your heart, lungs, and gut, and is the primary driver of the parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest state. The constant, subtle fear of disappointing someone, or the psychological effort required to mask your resentment, forces the vagus nerve to sustain a state of quiet, perpetual alert. This is not the dramatic fear of facing a mountain lion. This is the low-grade stress of having to be on all the time, of having to monitor every social cue to ensure you are meeting expectations. Over time, this effort leads to vagus nerve fatigue. It is the physiological signature of self-abandonment. Your system loses its ability to regulate effectively. It becomes stuck. You can no longer fluidly transition into deep rest or genuine joy. You are emotionally blunted, not because you lack empathy, but because your entire system is in a state of quiet, perpetual shutdown to conserve energy. Your inability to feel profound joy, anhedonia, is not a moral failing. It is the natural consequence of a neurological system that has been overloaded and is running on an emergency battery, prioritizing external survival over internal experience. The exhaustion you feel then is not just mental. It is the deep biological cost of living a life dictated by an outdated fear-based reward system. The neurological state we just mapped is not an arbitrary malfunction. It is the logical, biological endpoint of a profound psychological training that often begins in the quiet, unassuming spaces of our childhood. The fear that drives the dopamine hijack, the fear that exhausts the vagus nerve, is the fear of being deemed unworthy. You are carrying the weight of an unexamined subconscious contract rooted in conditional love. For many of us, the message was subtle, never explicitly stated. Affection is not a right. It is earned through performance. You learned that being agreeable was the safest path. Being kind meant being non-disruptive. Being the good kid, the easy friend, the reliable sibling, guaranteed your place in the ecosystem. You developed an acute sensitivity, a hypervigilance, to the emotional temperature of every room you walked into. Your primary survival skill became emotional forecasting, anticipating needs before they were even voiced, simply to preempt any possible conflict or disapproval. This psychological dynamic forced you to construct the mask of pure kindness. This mask is not a malicious deception. It is a highly refined defense mechanism. It's the face you present to the world to ensure your survival, a beautiful, polished surface that suggests you are entirely stable, infinitely available, and perpetually unbothered. The tragedy is that the longer you wear this mask, the more difficult it becomes to access the authentic face beneath it. You begin to confuse the performance with the self. The mask defines your identity, and the fear of taking it off, the fear of revealing the messy, needy, demanding truth, becomes paralyzing. And this brings us back to that heavy, toxic emotion that surfaces in the quiet moments: resentment. We must analyze resentment not as a character flaw, but as a crucial cry for psychological integrity. Resentment is the internal, emotional fallout of self-betrayal. It is your authentic self, the self whose boundaries were violated and whose needs were ignored, rising up to protest the abandonment. When you suppress anger or sadness in the name of peace, you are engaging in an act of profound self-violence. The suppressed emotions do not disappear. They are transmuted. They become the ghost of the abandoned self, a hollowed-out presence residing in your core, growing colder and more agitated with every forced yes. This ghost is trying to send you signals: the tightness in your chest, the sudden, inexplicable flare of anger at your partner for leaving a dish in the sink, the overwhelming desire to retreat and isolate. These are not signs that you are a bad person. They are signs that your system has reached its limit and the suppressed truth is attempting to erupt. The world sees the generosity, but it never sees the cost of the internal suppression. It never sees the psychological effort required to maintain the illusion of infinite capacity. And because you are so good at the performance, people around you naturally adjust. Without even realizing it, your perpetual kindness trains the world to overlook you. They stop asking what you want because they assume you are fine. They rely on your sacrifice because you have established it as your baseline behavior. You become indispensable, yet paradoxically, you become invisible. This invisibility is not peace. It is deep, isolating loneliness dressed up in the social currency of politeness. And it is a direct consequence of refusing to establish the essential psychological walls that define where your responsibility ends and theirs begins. You have allowed the relationships to blur into a dependence where your own needs are perpetually secondary. This is the dark side of kindness. It can become the very tool you use to dismantle your own sense of self. The logical conclusion we must now confront is perhaps the most uncomfortable. If your kindness requires the absence of yourself, it is not kindness at all. It is merely a transaction. We have spent our lives confusing the appearance of virtue with the reality of integrity. We mistake the quiet suffering of the martyr for the strength of a compassionate person. The essential insight needed for healing is this: true kindness requires the presence of the self. Think about the mask we discussed, that flawless, agreeable face. You put it on because you believe the authentic you is insufficient, too messy, or too demanding. But the mask, by its very nature, is hollow. When you give from behind a mask, you are not giving yourself. You are giving an empty performance. And an empty performance, regardless of how well received, can never truly sustain either the giver or the recipient in the long term. Genuine connection, genuine empathy, is not just about feeling what the other person feels. Neuroscience shows us that healthy empathy, the kind that heals rather than depletes, requires a crucial step: decoupling. It means feeling their pain, but maintaining enough psychological distance to know that their pain is not yours. It requires a clear, defined line between where their story ends and your capacity begins. And that defined line is what we call the boundary. For the chronic people pleaser, for the person who built their identity on agreement, the word boundary feels like an act of war. It feels cruel. It feels like selfishness. It feels like shutting people out. This fear is understandable because, deep down, you equate the boundary with rejection. You fear that saying no to a request is synonymous with saying no to the person, and that will trigger the old, paralyzing fear of abandonment. But let us reframe this. A boundary is not a wall built of anger. It is a line of honest definition. A boundary is the purest form of self-honesty, and therefore, the foundation of authentic kindness. When you establish a clear boundary, you are not rejecting the other person. You are doing three powerful things for yourself and the relationship. First, you are declaring, "This is what I can genuinely give, and this is what I cannot." You are shifting your action from compulsion to choice. Second, you are communicating. "My care for you is real, but it cannot exist if I am empty." You are treating your own well-being as the necessary precondition for your compassion. And third, you are stating, "I care enough about this relationship to protect it from my own resentment." A kindness that lacks boundaries inevitably rots into resentment. It is the essential chemical reaction of emotional depletion. The boundary, then, becomes the preservation agent. It prevents your generosity from decaying into bitterness. This is the signature insight. The boundary is the visible manifestation of the presence of the self. When you say yes to a request and you have a clear, defined boundary, your yes holds power because it is a true choice. When you say no, your no holds respect because it is honest. Both outcomes are rooted in integrity. The goal is to move from a place of performance, where your actions are dictated by fear, to a place of self-sovereignty, where your actions are dictated by your actual capacity. This is the only path that reverses the Anhedonia, because it reclaims your internal resources. You cannot fill from an empty glass, and the tragedy of the constant giver is that they have forgotten the glass is even theirs to protect. To understand why establishing this line of self-honesty feels so terrifying, we must confront the cultural myth of the good person and its dangerous cousin, pathological altruism. The myth, ingrained in many American and Western societies, teaches us that goodness is measured by self-erasure. Think of the compliments you've received. "She's such a good girl. She never causes trouble." Or, "He's the nicest guy. He'll always drop everything to help." Hidden within that praise is a destructive assumption that your value is inversely proportional to the demands you make. True goodness, society suggests, means having no needs, no limits, and no resistance. This cultural framework actively promotes pathological altruism, a psychological concept describing the state where the desire to help, through its exaggeration, actually causes harm, either to the giver or to the receiver. Consider the parent who sacrifices their entire career, financial stability, and mental health to the point of complete nervous system collapse. Their self-sacrifice looks saintly, but it creates profound emotional stress, debt, and eventual resentment, which inevitably spills onto the family they sought to protect. Or consider the friend who constantly rescues someone from financial or personal messes. The constant giving prevents the recipient from ever building the resilience and independence required for their own growth. Pathological altruism, fueled by your fear of rejection, creates dependency. It looks like love, but it is often rooted in a deeper, unconscious need to be needed, to secure your own value by making yourself indispensable. And this brings us to the greatest linguistic distortion that holds us captive, the word selfish. For the individual who grew up under the weight of conditional love, the word selfish carries the charge of a lethal accusation. We are conditioned to fear it more than we fear internal collapse. Any act of prioritizing rest, demanding respect, or simply saying no immediately triggers the internal alarm. You are being selfish. You will be abandoned. But we must clarify the definition. True selfishness is the disregard for others' well-being for personal gain. What you are attempting to do, setting a boundary, taking a dedicated rest day, or declining a request you cannot fulfill, is not true selfishness. It is self-care, which is the necessary prerequisite for sustainable compassion. It is the act of treating your own needs with the same respect and non-negotiable urgency that you habitually grant to everyone else. The tragedy is that you have been taught to view your own survival as morally suspect. You believe that your needs are optional, while everyone else's are mandatory. The shift required is a simple relabeling. Self-abandonment is the true moral failure here, not self-care. When you operate from a place of chronic depletion, your kindness becomes fragile, desperate, and often manipulative, even unconsciously. When you operate from a place of self-respect and fullness, your kindness flows from choice. It is reliable, and it carries the deep, quiet dignity of the authentic self. It is this dignity, this integrity, that we must reclaim from the cultural pressure to erase ourselves. The goal here is not to flip a switch and suddenly become harsh or uncaring. The goal is to move from enslaved kindness, kindness driven by obligation and fear, to liberated kindness, kindness rooted in authentic capacity. This transformation requires not massive outward changes, but small, deliberate shifts in your internal practice. First, we must internalize the rule of the oxygen mask. This metaphor is brutal in its clarity. In an emergency, you are instructed to secure your own mask first, before assisting a child or a loved one. Your capacity to care for anyone is entirely dependent on your sustained capacity for self-care. Protecting your rest, defending your time, and honoring your limits is the non-negotiable maintenance required to keep your own oxygen flowing. Setting this boundary is not selfish. It is the ultimate act of intelligent self-preservation. Practically, this begins with establishing a tiny, crucial space between the request and your response. We call this practicing the pause. For the chronic agreeable person, the answer yes is often automated, an immediate reflex driven by the fear alarm. When a request comes in, a new project, a social obligation, another favor, do not answer immediately. Take a slow, measured breath. Allow a few seconds of quiet space to check in with your deepest self. Ask 3 simple questions. Do I have the energy for this without depleting my reserves? Am I doing it from desire or from fear of rejection? Am I saying yes to them while simultaneously saying no to an important need of my own? Even that brief neurological pause disrupts the conditioned dopamine loop. It pulls the decision back from the exhausted amygdala and places it squarely in the rational, self-protective prefrontal cortex. Secondly, you must learn to welcome the hard emotions. Your anger, your frustration, your deep sadness. These are not enemies of kindness. They are vital signals from your internal system. They are the language of your abandoned self, telling you exactly where your boundaries are being violated, or where your psychological reserves have run dry. When you feel that resentment creeping in, don't suppress it again. Instead, pause and ask the resentment, what are you trying to protect? What truth am I refusing to acknowledge? Allowing yourself to feel the anger, to validate its source, prevents it from festering into the toxic ghost we discussed. It transforms the potential for destructive eruption into a powerful, honest guide toward balance. The initial attempts to set these boundaries will feel terrifying. You will feel the phantom weight of the silent armor trying to pull you back into submission. But you will gain something infinitely more valuable, the quiet, steady presence of your authentic self. You are reclaiming your integrity. Your worth is not earned by your exhaustion. You were worthy before you learned to perform kindness to survive. You are worthy when you rest. You are worthy even when you must say no. This realization is the seed of true, liberated compassion. We return now to the initial quiet of the room, to that hollow echo of yourself that you heard when the performance finally ended. That hollow echo was not the sound of failure. It was the sound of an empty stage. The deep psychological truth we have uncovered is this. The real monster within the kind person is not their anger, not their limits, and not the boundaries they struggle to set. The real monster is self-neglect. It is the systematic failure to honor the only contract that truly matters, the one you hold with your own well-being. Your task is not to become less kind. Your task is to become more honest. When you begin this quiet work of reclamation, when you practice the pause, when you gently enforce the boundary, when you allow the pain and anger to serve as guideposts, you will discover something profound. You will discover that your kindness does not disappear. In fact, it becomes stronger, sharper, and far more radiant. The kindness that flows from abundance is not frantic or desperate. It is calm, reliable, and deeply powerful. It is the kind of compassion that inspires others to rise, rather than simply relying on your constant collapse. When you show the world that you can be compassionate without erasing yourself, you offer a far more valuable gift than any sacrifice. You offer a model of integrity. There is an old simple saying that cuts to the core of this work. If you want to know who you truly are, look at how you treat yourself when no one is watching. Do you rest when the exhaustion is profound? Do you forgive yourself when you make a mistake? Do you speak to yourself with the same compassion and gentleness that you immediately extend to every stranger who asks for help? If the foundation of your inner life is built on criticism and self-abandonment, then your generosity to the outside world is built on a brittle and fragile surface. Your kindness becomes a form of emotional debt, a way to try and earn the self-worth you refuse to grant yourself freely. The final act of liberation is simply to set down the mask. You must allow yourself the vulnerability of revealing the self who has needs, the self who says no, the self who is sometimes messy and imperfect. You will feel fear because you know that some people who only love the mask will withdraw. But you will gain something infinitely more valuable, the quiet, steady presence of your authentic self. You reclaim your joy. You reverse the Anhedonia because you restore the internal resources required to experience life fully. The purpose of this journey is not about achieving some new moral high ground. It is about achieving internal coherence, aligning the person you present to the world with the truth of the person you are inside. So, the next time someone tells you how exceptionally kind you are, pause for that crucial moment. Don't just absorb the compliment. Ask yourself the most essential question. Is this kindness flowing from fear or from freedom? Is it coming from exhaustion or from abundance? Is it rooted in the performance of the mask or in the quiet, undeniable integrity of the authentic me? The answer to that question will tell you everything you need to know about the state of your soul. Your kindness doesn't need to be discarded. It needs to be transformed from a heavy leaden burden into the quiet, sustaining light of truth.